He built his life on being seen. Thousands of followers, carefully curated posts, a digital persona that promised connection, authenticity, charisma. But while Brett Dadig was performing for the camera, he was also watching. 11 women across 5 states, tracking their movements, appearing where they least expected him. And now, at 31 years old, he faces up to 70 years in prison for allegedly turning his platform into a hunting ground. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The indictment reads like a blueprint of modern terror. 14 counts spanning cyberstalking, harassment, unwanted physical contact, and the distribution of disturbing content online. But numbers cannot capture what it feels like to be watched by someone who has mastered the art of visibility. Someone who understands algorithms better than boundaries, someone who weaponized the very tools designed to bring people together. This is not a story about a monster hiding in shadows. This is about a man who operated in plain sight, whose face appeared on screens across the country, whose voice reached into homes and cars in quiet moments before sleep. And that makes it so much worse. Brett Dadig understood something fundamental about the digital age. Attention is currency, and surveillance has become normalized. We check our phones an average of 96 times per day. We share our locations. We post our routines. We broadcast our vulnerabilities in exchange for likes, comments, validation. The infrastructure of modern life is built on voluntary exposure. For most people, this creates a sense of connection. For someone like Dadig, it created opportunity. The allegations suggest a pattern that began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A comment here, a direct message there. The kind of interaction that could be dismissed as enthusiasm, as fandom, as the natural byproduct of social media engagement. But beneath the surface, something darker was taking shape. A systematic approach to gathering information, to mapping lives, to closing distance. Would you have noticed the warning signs? Would you have recognized the moment when interest became obsession? The first victim, according to court documents, met Dadig through his social media presence. She was a follower, someone who engaged with his content, who believed in the persona he projected. The relationship, if you could call it that, existed primarily online. Until it did not. She began noticing him in places he should not have been. A coffee shop she frequented. The gym where she worked out, outside her apartment building. Each appearance could be explained away as coincidence. The city was not that large. People crossed paths, but the frequency increased. The timing became too precise, and then came the calls. Harassing phone calls that arrived at odd hours. Messages that referenced things he could not have known unless he had been watching. Studying, documenting, the digital stalking had metastasized into physical presence, and the boundary between online and offline had dissolved completely. What drives someone to stalk? The question seems simple, but the answer reveals uncomfortable truths about power, control, and the human need for significance. Stalkers often operate from a place of profound inadequacy. Despite outward appearances of confidence or success, they harbor a deep-seated belief that they are invisible, unimportant, fundamentally unworthy of genuine connection. The act of stalking becomes a way to assert existence, to force recognition, to create a relationship, even if that relationship is built entirely on fear. For an influencer like Dadig, this psychology takes on additional layers. His entire professional identity was constructed around being watched, being admired, being the center of attention. But social media attention is ephemeral, algorithmic, ultimately hollow. Followers are not friends, likes are not love. And for someone whose sense of self depends on external validation, the emptiness can become unbearable. The allegations suggest that Dadig sought to transform passive viewers into active participants in his narrative. But when women did not respond the way he wanted, when they established boundaries or withdrew entirely, he allegedly escalated. The rejection was not just personal, it was existential. If he could not be loved, he would be feared. If he could not be chosen, he would be inescapable. Do you think someone can be driven to this by loneliness? Or does it require something fundamentally broken in how they see other people? As the investigation unfolded, more victims came forward. 11 women total, spread across 5 states. Each story carried its own specific horrors, but the patterns were chillingly consistent. One woman reported that Dadig had obtained her work schedule and began appearing at her place of employment. Not as a customer, not with any legitimate purpose. Simply to be seen. To remind her that he knew where she was. that he could access her whenever he chose. Another described unwanted physical contact during an encounter at a public event, a touch that lingered too long, a proximity that violated unspoken rules of personal space. When she pulled away, his expression did not register embarrassment or apology. Instead, she saw something cold, calculating, as if her discomfort was data to be processed rather than a boundary to be respected. The online component of the alleged harassment was particularly insidious. Dadig reportedly shared disturbing content that referenced his victims, content that walked the line between legal expression and direct threat. Posts that could be interpreted as artistic or metaphorical if viewed in isolation, but which took on sinister meaning when combined with the pattern of real-world stalking. This is the genius and the horror of modern harassment. Plausible deniability. Every individual action can be explained away. It is only when you step back and see the full picture that the predatory intent becomes undeniable. Law enforcement officials have indicated that the case against Dadig relies heavily on digital evidence. Phone records, GPS data, social media activity logs, security camera footage. The same technologies that enabled his alleged stalking also created an indelible record of his movements and communications. There is a bitter irony here. Dadig built his career on digital visibility, on crafting and controlling his online image. But that same digital infrastructure became the mechanism of his undoing. Every post, every location tag, every metadata point contributed to a comprehensive map of his activities. The investigation reportedly began when multiple women, unconnected to each other, filed complaints that shared striking similarities. Different jurisdictions, different timelines, but the same methods, the same escalating pattern of behavior. When investigators began cross-referencing reports, they discovered that Dadig had allegedly been operating across state lines, targeting women in a coordinated campaign that spanned months. Would you have reported it? Would you have believed that anyone would take it seriously? Many victims of stalking face a cruel paradox. The behavior is terrifying, but proving it is extraordinarily difficult. Individual incidents seem minor, coincidental, not worth police attention. It is only when the pattern becomes undeniable that the full scope of the violation becomes clear. And by then, the psychological damage has already been done. The impact of stalking extends far beyond the immediate fear of physical harm. It is a form of psychological warfare that corrodes a victim's sense of safety, autonomy, and reality itself. Victims often describe a feeling of being trapped in a nightmare where the rules of normal life no longer apply. They change their routines, their routes, their habits. They stop going to places they love. They withdraw from social activities. They become hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environment for threats. The stalker does not need to be physically present to exert control. The mere possibility of his presence is enough. Sleep becomes difficult, concentration suffers. Relationships strain under the weight of constant anxiety. Some victims develop symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, panic attacks, a persistent sense of impending doom. And there is another layer of violation that is harder to articulate but no less real. The loss of privacy, of the right to move through the world unobserved. We all carry an assumption that our daily lives are our own, that we can exist without being cataloged and studied. Stalking shatters that assumption. It transforms ordinary moments into performances, every action potentially monitored and recorded. One of Dadig's alleged victims described the experience as feeling like she was living in a fishbowl, constantly exposed, unable to escape scrutiny. She stopped posting on social media entirely. She changed her phone number multiple times. She considered moving to a different state. The stalking had effectively imprisoned her, even though she was technically free. Brett Dadig's case raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of influence, parasocial relationships, and the blurred boundaries between public and private life in the digital age. Influencers occupy a strange space in our culture. They are not quite celebrities, not quite ordinary people. They cultivate intimacy with their audiences, sharing personal details, inviting followers into their daily lives, creating the illusion of friendship. This is the business model: authenticity as commodity, connection as content. But this manufactured intimacy can create dangerous misunderstandings. Followers may feel they know an influencer personally, that they have a relationship that extends beyond the screen. For most people, this remains a harmless fantasy. But for some, the line between fantasy and reality dissolves. Did Dadig's career as an influencer contribute to his alleged behavior? Did the constant performance of connection, the addiction to attention, the feedback loop of validation and visibility warp his understanding of appropriate boundaries? Or was he always predisposed to this kind of behavior, and the influencer platform simply provided new tools and opportunities? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. Social media does not create stalkers, but it does provide them with unprecedented access to potential victims and sophisticated methods of surveillance. An influencer who understands algorithms, engagement metrics, and digital tracking has skills that can be weaponized. The charges against Dadig span multiple jurisdictions, which complicates the legal proceedings but also demonstrates the seriousness with which authorities are treating the case. Cyberstalking laws vary by state, but federal statutes allow for prosecution when the behavior crosses state lines or involves electronic communications. If convicted on all counts, Dadig faces up to 70 years in prison and a potential $3.5 million fine. These are not minor penalties. They reflect a growing recognition that stalking, particularly when facilitated by technology, is a serious crime with devastating consequences. But securing a conviction is not guaranteed. Defense attorneys will likely argue that Dadig's actions, while perhaps inappropriate, do not rise to the level of criminal stalking. They may claim that his presence in certain locations was coincidental, that his communications were misinterpreted, that his social media posts were artistic expression protected by the First Amendment. This is the challenge prosecutors face in stalking cases: proving intent, demonstrating that a pattern of behavior was deliberate, coordinated, and designed to cause fear or distress. Individual actions may seem innocuous. It is the totality of the circumstances that reveals the crime. The victims will likely be required to testify, to relive their experiences in open court, to have their credibility questioned and their reactions scrutinized. This is its own form of trauma, a secondary victimization that many survivors find almost as difficult as the original stalking. Would you be willing to testify? Would you be able to face your stalker in court and recount every terrifying detail? The Brett Dadig case is not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger pattern of technology-enabled harassment that has become increasingly common in the digital age. Studies suggest that approximately 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men have experienced stalking at some point in their lives. The numbers are likely higher as many victims never report the behavior. And with the proliferation of social media, GPS tracking, and other digital tools, stalking has become easier, more sophisticated, and more difficult to escape. We have built a society where surveillance is normalized. We carry tracking devices in our pockets. We voluntarily share our locations, our activities, our thoughts. We have traded privacy for convenience, for connection, for the dopamine hit of social validation. But this infrastructure of voluntary exposure has created new vulnerabilities. The same tools that help us stay connected to friends and family can be exploited by those with malicious intent. The same platforms that enable community and creativity can become weapons of harassment and control. The Dadig case forces us to confront these contradictions. How do we balance the benefits of social media with the risks? How do we protect potential victims without creating a surveillance state? How do we hold influencers accountable for their behavior while respecting freedom of expression? These are not easy questions, and the answers will shape the future of digital life. Social media companies have faced increasing scrutiny over their role in enabling harassment, stalking, and other forms of abuse. While platforms have implemented various safety features and reporting mechanisms, critics argue that these measures are insufficient and often reactive rather than proactive. In the Dadig case, questions have been raised about whether the platforms he used could have detected and intervened in his alleged pattern of behavior. Were there warning signs in his activity that should have triggered review? Did victims report his conduct, and if so, how did the platforms respond? The challenge is that platforms operate at massive scale, billions of users, trillions of interactions. Distinguishing between legitimate engagement and predatory behavior is extraordinarily difficult, particularly when stalkers are sophisticated enough to avoid obvious red flags. But the difficulty of the problem does not absolve platforms of responsibility. If social media companies profit from user engagement, they have an obligation to ensure that their tools are not being weaponized. This requires investment in better detection systems, more responsive support for victims, and meaningful consequences for users who violate community standards. Some advocates have called for platforms to implement features that give users more control over who can access their information and how their data is used. Others have suggested that platforms should be held legally liable when they fail to act on credible reports of harassment or stalking. The debate is ongoing, but the Dadig case adds urgency to the conversation. Every day that platforms fail to adequately address these issues, more people are put at risk. As the investigation progressed and more victims came forward, a picture emerged of a man whose carefully constructed public persona was crumbling. The influencer who had built his brand on charisma and connection was revealed to be someone who allegedly violated the most basic principles of respect and consent. Friends and collaborators began to distance themselves. Sponsors pulled their support. Followers who had once admired him expressed shock, disgust, betrayal. The same social media platforms that had amplified his voice now became forums for his condemnation. But even in the face of mounting evidence and public outcry, Dadig has maintained his innocence. His legal team has characterized the charges as a misunderstanding, a case of overzealous prosecution fueled by social media hysteria. They argue that he is being unfairly targeted because of his public profile, that his actions have been misinterpreted and sensationalized. This is a common defense strategy in stalking cases. Reframe the narrative. Portray the accused as the real victim. Suggest that the alleged victims are exaggerating, seeking attention, or motivated by revenge. It is a tactic designed to create doubt, to shift focus away from the pattern of behavior and onto the credibility of those who reported it. But the sheer number of victims, the consistency of their accounts, and the digital evidence make this defense increasingly difficult to sustain. The case against Dadig appears to be built on more than accusations. It is built on data, on documentation, on a trail of evidence that spans months and multiple states. As of now, the case is moving through the legal system. Pretrial hearings, motions, negotiations, the machinery of justice grinding slowly forward. For the victims, this period of waiting is its own form of torture. The stalking may have stopped, but the trauma continues. They live in a state of suspended resolution, unable to fully move forward until the case is concluded. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, hoping to raise awareness and encourage other victims to come forward. Others have chosen to remain anonymous, protecting what little privacy they have left. Both choices are valid. Both reflect the impossible position that stalking victims are placed in: speak out and risk further exposure, or stay silent and allow the behavior to continue unchallenged. The public response has been mixed. Many have expressed support for the victims and called for accountability. But others have questioned the severity of the charges, suggested that the women are overreacting, or defended Dadig based on their perception of his online persona. This is the insidious nature of parasocial relationships. People feel they know influencers based on curated content, and they struggle to reconcile the person they think they know with the allegations being made. It is easier to doubt the victims than to accept that someone you admired might be capable of such behavior. Do you trust what you see online? Do you believe you can truly know someone through their social media presence? The Brett Dadig case represents a potential turning point in how we think about influencer accountability, digital harassment, and the real-world consequences of online behavior. If convicted, Dadig will face significant prison time, a stark reminder that social media fame does not place someone above the law. But beyond the individual case, there are larger questions that society must grapple with. How do we create digital spaces that are both open and safe? How do we empower victims to report harassment without fear of retaliation or disbelief? How do we educate people about the warning signs of stalking and the resources available to those who are targeted? These questions do not have simple answers, but the conversation is essential. Every person who uses social media, who shares their life online, who engages with influencers and content creators, has a stake in creating a healthier digital ecosystem. The victims in this case showed tremendous courage in coming forward. They broke the silence that stalkers depend on. They refused to accept that this behavior was normal or acceptable. And in doing so, they may have prevented future victims from experiencing the same terror. Their stories are a reminder that behind every screen, every profile, every carefully curated post, there are real people with real vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities deserve protection, not exploitation. As the legal proceedings continue, one question lingers in the minds of those following the case. How many others are out there? How many influencers, content creators, or ordinary users are engaging in similar behavior, operating just below the threshold of detection, exploiting the trust and openness that social media encourage? The Dadig case may be unusual in its scope and the number of victims, but the underlying dynamics are not. Every day, people use digital tools to monitor, harass, and control others. Every day, victims struggle to be believed, to be taken seriously, to find safety in a world where privacy has become increasingly elusive. The technology will continue to evolve. The platforms will continue to grow. But unless we fundamentally rethink our relationship with digital surveillance, unless we prioritize consent and boundaries over engagement and growth, cases like this will continue to emerge. Brett Dadig built his life on being seen. But in the end, it was his watching that destroyed him. The same digital infrastructure that enabled his alleged crimes also documented them, creating an inescapable record of his actions. The hunter became the hunted, tracked by the very tools he had weaponized. There is a certain poetic justice in that. But for the 11 women whose lives he allegedly invaded, whose sense of safety he shattered, whose privacy he violated, justice will require more than poetry. It will require accountability, consequences, and a commitment from all of us to create a world where being visible does not mean being vulnerable. The trial will determine Brett Dadig's legal fate. But the broader questions his case raises will remain long after the verdict is delivered. Questions about power, about technology, about the price we pay for connection in the digital age. And perhaps most importantly, questions about what we owe each other in a world where the boundaries between public and private, between watching and being watched, have become dangerously blurred. Would you have seen the signs? Would you have acted differently? Would you have been one of the 11, or would you have been one of the thousands who followed him, unaware of what was happening behind the carefully constructed facade? These are the questions that should keep us awake at night. Because the next Brett Dadig is already out there, building an audience, cultivating trust, and waiting for the right moment to cross the line from influence to obsession. And the next victim might be someone you know, or it might be you.